night of the binding feast. A knife flashed across the throat of the bound man as the Cannibal King pronounced the name, and the crowd stilled. Fear anchored the survivor witness to her feet. She felt the thin line of terror convert into a decision to watch, to remember, to act. The ritual ground smelled of smoke and salted meat. Torches breathed hot air against the indifferent sky. The high ritualist read the ledger aloud, each accusation timed to the knife's lift, and the survivor witness counted names with her eyes, searching for one she could not accept. She had been at the edge of the crowd when the king stepped up, so close she could see the scar along his left temple and the bone, carved crown pressed to his brow. The survivor witness tightened her fingers around the bead necklace at her throat, feeling the bead smooth hole against her palm. Fear shifted into suspicion when she saw a guard hand a folded page to the high ritualist, fingers quick and careful. That small motion made her move through the press of bodies toward the side passage behind the altar. Suspicion became action. The first sentences set the stakes. The ritual was not a private slaughter but a tool of rule. The survivor witness had come home to a kingdom where civic order arrived wrapped in spectacle. She had been a farmer's daughter who returned with a shoulder scar and a ledger of her own losses. The village called her a witness because she had survived a raid and had the small carved bead of her family as proof. Now the ledger the high ritualist used named neighbors and cousins as criminals, and the survivor witness recognized the pattern. The king used accusation to remove opponents and hunger to bind obedience. The high ritualist's voice was dry and precise as he recited offenses for theft of grain, for conspiracy, for witching the rains, he said. And the crowd repeated certain phrases like a chorus. For the murder of 3 carts, he read, and a man with a daughter at his hip went pale. The survivor witness watched faces fold inward. She saw community elders nod as if the ledger's ink had turned into law. There was no trial, only the naming and the blade. She moved closer when the name she feared rose from the ritualist's lips. A tall guard stepped between her and the altar. His arm pushed her back. "Stand down," the guard said. "You will be next if you interfere." The guard's tone was curt. His wrist bore a metal guard stained dark. The survivor witness swallowed. She imagined the ledger's pages opened in a crowded hall, each entry a sentence written not by crime but by command. Doubt loosened into anger as she watched the guard slide a page into the ritualist's palm. A side passage offered a thin pocket of shadow. The survivor witness slipped behind a stack of crates and watched the high ritualist's hands from a narrow slit between crates. He unfolded the page and pressed a finger to an inked correction. She held her breath until she felt her lungs ache. That factual detail ink smudged around a name was what transformed suspicion into the need to expose it. She could not release that knowledge without risk, and the risk named itself in each torch flare. The king performed the feast as theater. He lifted his chin, spoke a single phrase in the old tongue, and the guards hauled forward a figure bound with rope. The Cannibal King moved with measured pauses, letting the silence stretch into threat. He tapped the ceremonial knife against the altar once and then twice, each tap a punctuation the audience absorbed. The survivor witness watched his hand. The bone amulet at his throat shifted with his motion. The king raised the knife, and the high ritualist called the crime. A woman in the crowd gasped when she heard the name. "No," she whispered. The survivor witness heard the guards step in, heard the woman's voice cut off. Dialogue flickered in short bursts across the crowd. "The name is false," someone said. "Who will speak for the boy?" An elder demanded high ritualist show proof. Another voice snapped. The high ritualist's reply was a single line. "The ledger is the proof." The Cannibal King then leaned forward and said, "Names bind us. Hunger binds loyalty." His voice held no tremor. The survivor witness flinched at his calm. His clinical delivery hardened the spectacle into policy. At the altar dais, the ceremonial gestures blurred piety and punishment. The king smeared a dark paste across his wrist, and lifted the knife, not for killing alone, but to remove flesh ceremonially and to feed it into the ritual. People in the first rows cried out, some in awe, some in fury. The survivor witness noticed how elders watched for signs of divinity, while guards watched for signs of dissent. The ritual redefined cruelty as duty, a civic terror dressed as sacred right. That redefinition made it harder to argue against the king, because those who argued were the ones the ledger soon named. When the survivor witness recognized a condemned man as her cousin, her actions turned practical and immediate. She pushed through the crowd. A guard shoved her shoulder. Get back. The guard said, this is not your place. Her hand reached for her shawl instead of for the man. She called his name through clenched teeth. Tuma, she said. That one direct plea forced a response. Thomas' eyes met hers for a second wide, then closed as a guard hauled him forward. The survivor witness' chest tightened. Fear again pushed into a new shape, personal grief edged by a burning need to rescue. The crowd surged when the survivor witness moved. A community elder stepped forward to speak. Elder McCory, someone called. Elder McCory, speak now. Elder McCory's voice cracked before he could finish. We follow the rites, he said. We cannot undo the law. The survivor witness heard betrayal in that compliance. The ritual had already eaten the moral language of the elders. She tried to show the ledger's correction then, but a guard snatched the paper from her hands and smoothed it into the high ritualist's robe. That violent interception was an external event that forced the story into a new direction. The ledger was tampered with in full sight. In the cramped passage behind the altar, the survivor witness found one guard folding a tucked page. She grabbed his wrist. Why did you hand this to him? She demanded. Her voice vibrated. The guard's face did not change. He answered with a single sentence. Orders. He tried to pull away. She hit his forearm, felt bone under the skin. He cursed. The guard's rough words and quick fists showed the village's power structure. Obedience first, truth second. She pried a corner loose and saw the inked correction. The name had been altered. A different person was now listed as conspirator. Doubt melted into outrage. The survivor witness understood in a concrete way how the king used ledger and knife together. Fabricate a charge, stage a public feeding, cement fear. She pocketed the torn corner before the guard could snatch it back. The act, tucking a page into her satchel, was small, physical, and irreversible. It was her decision point. Soon afterward, she stepped back to the crowd and tried to catch a look at the high ritualist's ledger. The high ritualist held the book like a bureaucrat shielding a ledger from inspection. Stay where you are, he said, voice thin. The rites proceed. An argument broke out. 3 villagers shouted that names were false. 3 enjoined silence. The survivor witness watched the ebb of resistance as the guards closed ranks. There was a rapid exchange between the high ritualist and one of the community elders. We need order. The elder, we need obedience, the high ritualist answered. Their curt back and forth showed how ritual had become an administrative instrument. The survivor witness attempted to step forward and show the torn corner. A guard seized her wrist and raised his voice. Hold. You will be named next if you continue, he said. The guard's warning contained a promise. She looked at the Cannibal King, who stood watching the altercation like a conductor waiting for the final chord. He raised his hand once, and 2 guards dragged a dissenting man to the ground. The survivor witness saw the blade arc. The crowd recoiled into a silence that felt carved into their faces. That was the moment the ledger's truth tried to surface, and the king slammed it down with force. The ledger tampering discovery led directly to exposure. As the survivor witness shouted the word, altered, the high ritualist slapped a palm on the book and barked for silence. Her single accusation created a ripple. He lies, a voice shouted. He changes names. The high ritualist's response was swift. Enough, he said. We follow the law as written here. Then the Cannibal King stepped down from the dais and walked through the light to the survivor witness. He stopped within arm's reach and looked at her directly. You "The Cannibal King, you have seen too much." He did not raise his voice. The calm in his tone cut like the knife. "Are you sure of what you saw?" he asked. The survivor witness answered with 2 words. "I saw ink." Her statement was concrete. She did not plead. She presented the torn corner on the table between them. The high ritualist tried to cover the scrap with his hand. "That is a smudge," he said. "An error." The guards tightened their circle. The survivor witness felt fear return, then shift into a cold resolve. If she could not stop the ritual, she would at least preserve proof. The Cannibal King chose to make an example. He signaled the guards with a small tilt of his head. 2 men seized the survivor witness's arm and dragged her to the front. The crowd watched with held breath. The king did not shout. He permitted the scene to carry itself. "You try to sully the rites," he said. "You will learn what happens to those who cast doubt." The ritual that followed was more violent than the survivor witness had expected. The guards threw a man to his knees and forced a raw meat offering to his mouth. The crowd flinched. Some shifted forward to get a better look. Others pressed their palms over their children's eyes. A mid-chapter mini cliffhanger arrived when the high ritualist, in an act of seeming piety, offered the ledger to the survivor witness and intoned that she could read aloud a page. "Read," he said. The survivor witness had the torn corner in her satchel. Saying so long would have meant certain death. She reached under her shawl and touched the paper. Elder McCory stepped forward and whispered, "Do not pull the village into chaos." The survivor witness looked at Tomo on his knees and then at the king. The ledger lay heavy between them like a loaded scale. She made a choice. She would not make the ledger the spectacle. She folded the torn page further into the satchel and let the high ritualist close the book. The king escalated to enforce compliance. He ordered a public punishment. A feeding staged with a condemned man forced to bite meat that had been marked with the state's scent. The survivor witness watched Thomas' jaw snap as guards forced the meat to his lips. He bit, coughed, and a guard slapped him. "Eat," the Cannibal King softly. The king used spectacle to erase protest. People who had come for protection left with the memory of a communal observed horror and fewer questions. After the spectacle, the crowd thinned into the ritual ground's outskirts. The high ritualist moved among people and adjusted stories with a ledger and murmured phrases, indexing names with a thumbnail. He small lies to calm old friends. "This was necessary," he said to a woman who had once sold him herbs. "We keep the rains, we feed the children." His voice was bureaucratic and calm. The survivor witness watched him speak to the community elders. Each small reassurance rewired consent into complicity. Her fear shifted again, this time into quiet calculation. Fear to suspicion to resolve. In the prayer dawn behind the ritual ground, the survivor witness slipped into a shadowed storage hut. She shared the torn page with a silent ally, a man who had once been a guard but left the ranks and now kept a low profile. "Look," she said, handing him the paper. "Look at this." The silent ally studied the ink and whistled through his teeth. "This is deliberate," he said. "They fabricate to eliminate rivals." He checked his pockets and handed her a small strip of cloth to wrap the page. They agreed on a plan in brief sentences. "Hide it in the mud wall by the baker's oven." The silent ally suggested, "I will watch the place at dawn." Their exchange was terse. Action replaced sentiment. The survivor witness resolved to bear witness. She could not convince the elders in public, and direct confrontation had only fed the king's power. So she chose preservation, hiding the ledger fragment where she could retrieve it later and smuggling names out to other villages in code. Her decision was practical and concrete. She bound the page to the bead necklace and formed a route for the evidence to travel. The plan was not a promise of victory, but a way to keep truth from vanishing. The chapter closed with a concrete situational beat. As the survivor witness and the silent ally left the hut, the village bell struck twice to call workers to the fields. A guard passed the doorway and nearly collided with them. He did not recognize the bead peeking from under her shawl. He only grunted and moved on. The survivor witness slid the torn ledger into her satchel and stepped into the weak light of dawn, chest tight, hands steady. She had escaped public death and had a scrap of inked truth. The ledger fragment would not by itself topple the Cannibal King, but it would become a record, names to be read and verified. An act of remembrance that might yet unravel the ritual's power. The chapter's emotion root, fear, had shaped each choice. Fear that first pinned her to the crowd, suspicion that pushed her to the passage, outrage that made her seize the guard's wrist, and resolve that drove her to hide the ledger fragment. Two clear emotion shifts had guided the arc: suspicion to fear to resolve, and fear to outrage to quiet calculation. The survivor witnesses' actions and the terse dialogues around her revealed relationships and power without broad reflection. By the end, the immediate conflict of the ledger's tampering had been resolved into concealment and resistance. The mid-chapter cliffhanger closed when she chose not to read the ledger aloud and instead preserve its proof. The final concrete beat, the bell, the guard passing, the satchel against her hip, closed the chapter on a situational note, not on a speech or a vow. The village would wake to work while the ledger fragment waited against her ribs. The ledger of blood. Two guards slammed the ledger onto the table and dragged a bound man into the inner sanctum. Suspicion rose in the survivor witness before she could name it. She watched the inked names and saw pattern where others saw devotion. The high ritualist did not look up at first. He kept one hand on the charred staff and used the other to flip the ledger's spine so the crowd could see the list. The bound man's lips were already blue from rope and cold. Blood had dried at the collar where the feast's blade had touched the skin the night before. The ledger room smelled of soot and old glue. The survivor witness stood against a low shelf, fingers curled where the ledger's shadow fell. She had watched the binding feast. The memory of the knife and the man's fall stayed in specific detail, the salt on the victim's lips, the way the torchlight struck the carved bone crown, the precise sound the blade made as it left its sheath. Suspicion tightened her jaw and set her hands on a choice: hide what she had seen or preserve it. She moved closer to the doorway to see the ledger's pages without being seen. The high ritualist lifted his chin when the guards shoved the book open. Names for the next feast, he said, voice dry, each syllable measured like a toll: family, rank, offense. Sacred order. His fingers tapped a line, names annotated with small charcoal marks. The room leaned forward. The guard released his captive, and the man collapsed to the floor, gagged and breathing shallow. The survivor witness memorized the first column. She felt the ledger's pages under her fingertips when she slid one closed and then pulled it again, reading quickly. Households, tax tallies, a mark that matched the ledger's sacrificial code. She mouthed one name under her breath, Luba, and committed it to a knot in her throat. The ledger did not read like prayer. It read like an account book. They moved her out before dawn, after the shouting. In the canvas shelter behind the market, survivors patched one another's wounds with boiled leaves and bandage strips. Nalo checked a burn on the survivor witness' forearm and did not ask why she had come back. Mara sat with a pail of water and watched the sky pale. The survivor witness set the ledger on a wooden crate and closed her hands around it as if the book were the beating heart of a beast. You should not bring that here, Mara, voice low. They will trace a page to this shelter. Mara's voice shook when she said they. The survivor witness's lips were tight. We know what they do, she said. We know what the king does. Her fingers scraped the ledger's rough edge and tightened. Her decision shifted from suspicion to resolve. She would keep a record that might end the ritual or at least tell the truth to people who could act. They planned in the daylight near the market where the king's banners still fluttered. The survivor witnessed nothing publicly. She watched the ritualists moving like clerks and the king moving like a man who counted fear as tax. The high ritualist visited the day's mid-morning with the ledger wrapped in a linen cloth. He held it out to the Cannibal King like an offering. "Read it." The king, voice even. He scanned the names with a detached attention, pausing at a household list that matched a wealthy trader who had refused extra levies. "Cut from the crown those who refuse," he said. He put down the ledger and adjusted the bone crown on his head. The high ritualist smiled slightly, then closed the book. Their exchange felt bureaucratic, sacrament disguised as bookkeeping. Back in the ledger room that afternoon, the survivor witness slipped through a gap in the sanctum's rear panels. She moved quietly. She had learned to read the rhythm of guards' steps and the hush of ritualists at prayer. Inside, she found a hidden shelf behind a loose plank. Her hands trembled when she pried the plank free and pulled out a bundle of tax receipts, correspondences, and a folded petition stamped with a rival family's seal. The annotations connected names to bribes, late harvest tallies, and land transfers. Each mark on the ledger matched one of these papers. She read a specific line. A ledger mark beside the name of the merchant Kier, then a letter ordering his arrest over a contrived debt. The discovery hit her chest like a solid fist. The ritual feasts were purged by another name. She copied a single notation into the ledger's margin. Tax record linked to sacrament, see certificate A19. Her hands moved with precise, shallow breaths. Her fingers had barely replaced the plank when a guard's shadow filled the doorway. "What's there?" he asked. The survivor witness froze, the plank between them, the ledger in her arms. The guard's face was a hard, unblinking thing. She tried to hand him the ledger as if it were a common relic. He did not take it. Instead, he seized her wrist and hauled her into the corridor. They dragged her before the high ritualist. The corridor's torchlight stung her eyes and left the salt of sweat on her upper lip. The high ritualist did not raise his voice at first. He simply spread the ledger open so the guard and the survivor witness could see the margin she had written in. "You wrote in a sacred text," he said, fingers steady on a rune. "What do you call this, woman?" He tapped the ledger where her handwriting sat, neat and small. "I wrote the truth," she said. She refused to look at her own shaking hand. "You use names to punish families. You use markers to take land," her words carried. The ritualist frowned and reached for the charred staff, as if it would help him find roads through the accusation. "You are a survivor, the high ritualist. You should be grateful. The king keeps order." He leaned forward. "Obey and you will live. Refuse and you will be named properly." His diplomacy was a blade under oil. "Obey, survivor witness. Obey, or we bind you to the list." Nalo stepped forward, voice cutting the soft hall. "Do not bind her for looking, ritualist. We will speak for her." Nalo's tone carried the bluntness of someone who had seen a harvest burned. He set down a palm on the ledger's open page. "Nalo," the high ritualist sharply, "do you threaten my authority?" He moved like a man correcting a ledger entry. "I speak the truth," Nalo replied. "You make the truth a ledger." Kier's debt was paid. "The mark is paper work." He jabbed a finger at the page. "You stamp people for profit and call it holy." The corridor tightened with quiet. A dozen faces leaned in from further halls. The ritualist's answer was measured but quick. "You will not judge the rituals, Nalo. You will not call them by names you learned in market talk." He tapped the ledger again, and the guards shifted like a flock. 3 rapid lines followed then, an argument tightening the hinge of the chapter. "The ledger names more than gods. Nalo, it names enemies. You speak against the king." The high ritualist returned. "You risk your head." A guard said. "We risk nothing." Mara under her breath. Each line landed like a small stone. The corridor's tension rose. The ritualist offered a bargain. He spoke slowly and with the politeness of someone setting a price. "Remove the note," he said to the survivor witness. "Work for the temple. Catalog the names. Be a recorder under oath." His eyes did not soften. "We will spare those you know if you serve us." She had a sudden memory of the binding feast. The knife's edge, how the crowd stilled at the name pronounced. She thought of the bound man's throat, and the way the king had tasted victory, then as though swallowing bitter grain. The survivor witness let silence show her decision. "I will not be your clerk," she said. "I will take the ledger, and I will tell the truth elsewhere." Her words were small but firm. Her resolve shifted again, suspicion to resolve to open defiance. The high ritualist leaned in as if to measure the space between threat and compliance. He looked at each guard and then at the survivor witness. "So be it," he said. "We will teach you the consequences of refusing." His face did not move with anger. He moved with the calm of someone entering a counting season. They took her to the central ritual ground at dusk in spite of the bargaining. The king's days rose like a carved tooth in the torchlight. People assembled, women with their children tucked at their sides, men who sold grain, men who had lost land. The survivor witness, hands bound, had the ledger placed on a wooden stool before the crowd so everyone could see the black marks sewn into the pages. She had hidden the additional papers in her shawl. The high ritualist called the names for the next ceremony as if reading from a prayer. The crowd listened. At the edge of the physical world, the survivor witness released a single breath that felt like a decision made of stone. She pushed forward, slipped free from the guards with a movement practiced, while tending wounds. With both hands, she thrust the ledger up until the pages faced the crowd. "Read this!" she cried. Her voice split the practiced hush. People craned forward. The ledger's margin showed the notation she had copied and the hidden papers she had tucked inside. They used sacred feasts to silence rivals. The ledger names tax receipts, debts manufactured, letters of bribery. Her words forced eyes to move from the king to the book. A murmur began like wind in dry grass. The Cannibal King descended from his dais at once. He moved slowly, the bone crown ringing faintly when it brushed the heavy beaded neckpiece. "You would accuse us in public?" he asked. His voice did not rise. The quiet was heavier for it. The high ritualist began to speak, his tone the same ledgered calm. "You lie," the high ritualist declared, and then the crowd split. "You lie." One man repeated, others shouted back. The survivor witness heard names: the merchant Kier, a woman called Luba, people she had known by face and trade. Arguments erupted around her. The ritualist pushed forward. The guards formed a tight ring. Words became fight. The ritualist snapped, "Put her down!" A guard reached. Nalo shoved back. The crowd split into those who remembered sons taken by feasts and those who had reason to fear the king's wrath. Sobs and angry cries tangled. The king raised his hand to restore order, but his hand did not tremble. He measured people like coins. 3 quick exchanges cut across the assembly. "How do you prove this?" A trader demanded here, the survivor witness, and she plunged a hand into her shawl and drew out the folded petition with the rival family's seal. Kier paid. "The seal is stamped. Forgery," the high ritualist. "Proof, give us proof." "A ledger and receipts," Mara shouted. "Open them. See the names, see the marks." The rhythm of accusation quickened. The king took the ledger and flicked pages with the contempt of someone handling unwanted cloth. "These are names," he said, "names for balance and for law." He looked up. Bone crown shadowing his eyes. "You would trade law for rumor." He stopped on a marked page and his gaze snagged on a family name linked to a rival chieftain. Then something unexpected happened. A trader in the crowd pushed forward with a tax receipt in his hand and a voice that carried market certainty. "I paid Kier's debt," he said. "Kier has receipts. He paid with grain to the king's store last month." A murmur of surprise moved through the crowd. Another voice replied, "We have ledgers too." Hands went into aprons and pulled out petty accounts and tax stamps. The narrative the ritualists had shaped began to crack because civilians produced paper with dates and signatures. The high ritualist lunged for the ledger. He wanted to control the book, to close its mouth. He grabbed the margin where the survivor witness had written and tried to erase it. A guard raised a club. Nalo shoved the guard away and a scuffle broke out within arm's reach of the dais. The king shouted for silence. His command fell like a hammer. Some obeyed, some recoiled. Within 2 minutes the assembly fractured into opposing camps. One side shouted for the king to order a new hearing. Another side yelled that any dissent meant treason. Firelight struck faces. People pointed at one another. The survivor witness barked a single name at the ritualist. "You took Lubas' field!" The accusation hit like a struck bell. Lubas' cousin stepped forward, saying, "He took my cousin's field after her husband refused the king's levy." The crowd's noise rose into a dangerous hum. The high ritualist attempted a public calm. "This is slander," he said. "The king will call for order. The feast will proceed once truth is determined." His voice had the habit of turning verbs into absolutes. The king, however, did not finish that evening's rite. He raised his hand and signaled the guards to seize the ledger and the survivor witness. The threat was clear. Control the record, control the story. A sudden shove from the crowd knocked Mara into the survivor witness. Hands clutched at the ledger. Nalo shoved a man trying to take it. The high ritualist grabbed the ledger. Then a line of guards formed a human wall and dragged the survivor witness away. The king ordered a crackdown. Knees, clubs, and rope moved in choreographed efficiency. Citizens who had been on the verge of speaking fell back under the threat of immediate violence. Amid the chaos, a new voice rose, Maras, piercing. "The ledger leaves now," she said. She lunged through the scattering bodies and seized the ledger, cloth. She shoved the book into the survivor witness' arms and pushed her toward a narrow alley where a group of allies waited. Nalo met them at the hidden passage, a hand already on the latch. They ran with the ledger pressed to the survivor witness' chest. Torches behind them threw long lines on stone walls. The king's men chased a few steps and then slackened as the alley swallowed sound. They reached a hidden shelter where other survivors had taken refuge. A low room beneath a potter's shop, reeking of clay and wet straw. Nalo forced the shelter door closed and slid a bolt. They sat in the dark and listened to the distant noise of the ritual ground. A muffled bell and the stamp of boots. The ledger lay on a reed chest between them. They opened it. Names stared up like numbers. The survivor witness read aloud the entries she had copied, voice raw but steady. "Here is the petition from the merchant Kier. Here is the tax exchange signed by the tax officer, Teru. See the ledger mark beside Teru's name." They named the signatures and the dates, matching the ledger to the hidden papers. The group catalogued what they could carry and what they could hide. Two survivors, Mara and Nalo, unfolded the strategy. "We will smuggle copies to coastal traders. Nalo, we will let the tax office see its own records. We will not shout at the dais again. We will prove it." Mara's mouth was a line. "We will not be foolish. The king will search. We must scatter evidence." The pair's plan turned the immediate uproar into patient, dangerous work. The survivor witness watched them and felt her anger melt into the slow mechanics of resistance. They worked into the night. Every 2 hours someone stepped outside to listen. Every set of minutes the assistant burned a scrap of paper after copying. Every whispered exchange pinned a new route for the ledger's truth. The survivor witness transcribed names until her wrist ached and the ink blurred on her fingers. Her hands trembled less as the night passed. Her movements became precise like a stitch. A twist came at sunrise. A courier arrived at the shelter with a single coin and a wet bundle of cloth. He handed sealed papers with the king's wax but smudged margins. "A merchant at the harbor left these last night," he said. "He would not speak if I named him." The papers contained a delivery manifest with the king's tax marks and signatures matching those annotated in the ledger. The courier's arrival changed the scale of their evidence. The ledger was no longer an isolated account. It matched official transport records. The group looked at each other in a silence that carried a different weight, one of action now bordering on danger with reach. Mara folded the manifest into the ledger. "This is proof," she said. Kier paid. The king knew. The ritualists used the ledger to bury that proof. Nalo tapped an entry with a fingernail. We move tonight to the coastal markets. We give copies to traders who have no reason to fear the king here. Their decision made the ledger both weapon and burden. The survivor witness could have felt triumphant. Instead, she catalogued the costs. The faces of those taken at the binding feast, the man whose throat had been cut, the sting of torches in the chamber. She checked the ledger once more and felt a quiet shift inside her. Suspicion had grown into purpose, then hardened under fear, and now settled into method. She folded a page carefully and tied a string around the reed chest. The plan required patience and secret roots. It required allies who could be trusted with ink and courage. At noon they arranged a route. Mara would take a copy to a coastal trader named Sifu. Nalo would carry a second to a scribe in the valley. The survivor witness would hold the original until safe passage could be secured. They distributed names and times. Each movement was a promise of danger. They waited for nightfall. When darkness came, someone knocked softly at the shelter door. 3 light taps, the signal they had agreed upon. The survivor witness took the ledger and rose. Nalo and Mara moved to the doorway. As Mara unlatched the bolt, the survivor witness pressed the ledger into her arms and said, "Go now." "Do not stop," Mara nodded, lips tight. They slipped out into the lane in pairs, 3 shadows against stone. Behind them, the ritual ground's torches burned low. The king's men still patrolled. The survivor witness watched Mara and Nalo disappear around a corner with the ledger's cloth tucked beneath an arm. She felt the ledger's weight in her memory like an arranged account. Names recorded, burdens moved, truths entrusted. They left the shelter with the ledger divided among trusted hands. And for the first time since the binding feast, the survivor witness allowed herself a single concrete action to mark the chapter's end. She closed the shelter's trapdoor and set a clay pot over the bolt so the sound of rummaging would be mistaken for a stray delivery. The pot's hollow scrape on wood was a mundane noise, but it was the action that locked the ledger into motion. Somewhere beyond the lane, the king and his ritualists rearranged their numbers. Within the shelter, the ledger rested in the dark, and the survivors planned the next move. The chapter's conflict had resolved into an interim. The public reveal had failed to topple the king immediately, but it had exposed the ledger and created an organized resistance. The survivor witness had risked everything, been caught, bargained with, and then forced a public reveal that split an assembly and produced allies. The ledger now traveled in secret. The last concrete sound in the room was Mara's footfall receding and a low knock at the distant door, a signal that would reset the next conflict. Outside, torches burned low on the ritual ground. Inside, a reed chest held pages that named names. The survivor witness sat and rubbed ink from her fingers until the skin showed pale. She listened for another knock and heard only the slow drip of rain from the eaves. The ledger had been exposed, the king's method made visible, and a chain of small choices had converted suspicion into a structure people could act on. The night held the ledger and the plan. A knock came at the shelter's outer door, deliberate and 3 times. A new visitor or new danger. The survivor witness rose to answer, handing the reed chest's strap to Nalo before she moved toward the sound. The stolen page. The survivor witness tore a single page from the high ritualist's ledger as a sentinel's torch shifted and a guard's boot scraped the flagstones. Suspicion sat in her chest like a stone. She had watched the ledger before and seen patterns where others saw devotion. The torn paper folded into her palm. A thread of fear ran down her spine. Then she steeled herself and moved toward the shadow beneath the priest's table. She moved because the ledger had changed everything. In the inner sanctum earlier that night, the ledger had been slammed on wood with 2 palms, and a bound man dragged across the threshold. The survivor had stood at the edge of the doorway, fingers clenched on the shawl at her shoulder, and watched inked names fall into ordered columns. She had left that room with a concrete question. Were those names offerings or targets? She slipped the page as the sentinel glanced toward the doorway. The torchlight found a line of wet letters on the page, dates, locations, a mark beside several names. She felt the first shift, suspicion giving way to urgent dread. When she read a village name she recognized and a mark she had seen carved onto a thigh at the binding feast. She folded the paper twice, folded it again, and tucked it beneath her tunic. The sentinel guard passed by with a casual step. He did not look down. The high ritualist remained where he had been, a pale knot of concentration, thumb tracing the ledger spine even while he spoke. The survivor's hands remembered the binding feast. A knife flashed, blood and smoke, the Cannibal King's voice pronouncing a name. She had watched then and decided to watch again now. She slipped out into the alleys. Torches carved hard cones of light against mud, brick walls. Guards moved in pairs, boots striking the packed earth in regular time. A ritual acolyte moved ahead with a lantern that threw the acolyte's skullcap into relief. The survivor kept to shadow, head low, the torn page pressed to her ribs like evidence of a crime. A pair of guards heard her breath and stepped toward her. One raised a hand. The survivor froze, the page a warm rectangle against her sternum. "Stop," said a dispatched guard in a voice that cut the night. The survivor did not drop the paper. She turned and ran. She ran because the ledger had to be seen by someone who could read more than ritual. She ran because the ledger showed a pattern she could not bear to leave in private hands. In the chase, fear replaced suspicion. She ducked between stacked clay jars. A guard's spearhead nicked her shawl and snagged threads. Her calf slammed into a pile of woven mats, and she went down hard, breath forced out, palms raw from pushing on packed earth. She kept the page folded and whole. She reached the safe house at a narrow door between two collapsed walls. The village midwife opened without surprise. The midwife's hands smelled of boiled herbs. She held a small oil lamp that steadied the survivor's shaking. The survivor pressed the torn paper into the midwife's palm. "Read it." The survivor, "Show it then." The midwife's voice was blunt. She closed the door and set the lamp on a low stool. She did not ask who had taken it. The survivor had been back to her before. Her hands unfolded the strip of ledger as if opening a wound. The midwife read aloud in a whisper. "Cato, third harvest, marked with a chipped column. Leia, binding feast 2 moons marked. Luga." She stopped at a name, throat working. "These are not offerings. These are a list." The midwife tapped the ink, "Not random." A pattern carved into the schedule. Their voices were low, clipped sentences that built the plan like a chair from raw wood. The midwife's reaction slid from quiet shock to focus. She pulled a small reed and rubbed soot across her thumbnail to trace portions of names. "If this ledger proves the king is picking those to satisfy a number," she began. The survivor nodded. Her jaw tightened. A second emotion shift arrived. Fear hardened into a shaky determination. She would not stand aside and let the ledger keep naming people. They made a small list from memory and the smudged ink. The midwife added a last name, the midwife's sister, who had disappeared after the binding feast. The survivor touched the midwife's forearm, fingers pressing into scar tissue. "We have to show it during the rite," the survivor whispered, "at the next public feast." "We will be killed if we try," the midwife said. She the sentence's fact, not hyperbole. "You saw the king at the dais. He stares as if he weighs souls. He will call us traitors." The midwife's face folded into a plan. "We will not show it together. We bring the ledger to the common place. You draw eyes, I will stand at your back." They brought 2 others into the plan. A reluctant ox driver and a woman who worked the granary. The recruited villager crept from the shadows of the meeting place with a voice that quivered. "I'll take it to the market and make the call. I'll tell people to gather." He wrapped his hands around the rim of a clay mug as if it grounded him. The survivor watched them hesitate and vote in whispers. The survivor had learned to measure loyalty by the ease of one's breath. The group's breath shortened. Hesitation became sweat on palms. The survivor's suspicion had already shifted through fear and into a cautious hope that action could change something. They planned a simple exposure. At the next public rite, the survivor would be at the fringe, hold the torn page for a witness to read, and then call for an inquiry. The midwife would carry a basket, and someone would shout a quarrel to pull attention. They mapped positions by sound and light, by the king's sightlines and the high ritualist staff. Before dawn, a trembling recruit slipped away. The survivor, midwife, and ox driver waited under the granarie's shadow, dawnblood grey along the roofline. They heard the recruit's footsteps slow. Someone from above hissed silence. A minute later, the recruit returned with a look on his face that broke the group's narrow hope. "He saw me," the recruit said. The high ritualist took my hand and asked questions. He did not meet the survivor's eyes. He me to listen and report. They promised safety for my daughter. The room spun around the recruit's confession. The group had to decide now. The survivor's hands tightened into a fist, skin whitening around the knuckles. The midwife's mouth closed. The recruit choice shifted power. They could proceed and risk immediate capture, or abort and try a subtler plan. That was a sudden and violent emotional shift in the room. Anger, betrayal, then brittle calculation. "You him." The survivor, "I didn't he want to." The recruit began. "You let them bargain for your child," the midwife said. "You put us all in danger," the recruit stammered, then said. "They showed me the king's ledger. They threatened me. The king would spare one if I stopped this." The survivor reached for the recruit's wrist and then let go. She kept her voice tight. "We changed the plan. We go in smaller numbers. The midwife will create a distraction in the south aisle. You ox driver will wedge a cart. I will carry the page to the dais. We will not shout. We will present the ledger as a public petition." They spread out. The midwife moved with a loaded basket toward the ground where offerings were mounded. The ox driver took his cart and put it where it would block the path between the congregation and the inner sanctum. The survivor shortened her stride, hiding the page within the folds of her shawl. They infiltrated the ritual grounds under torchlight. The Cannibal King sat high on his dais, silhouette carved by flame. He wore his bone-carved crown. He smelled of smoked flesh and the metallic tang of old ceremonies. The high ritualist stood close, staff in hand, ledger bound to his hip. The survivor felt the king's stare hit her first. He held it like a physical pressure. She felt her muscles cohere. She edged forward. The midwife's basket brushed an onlooker and spilled a handful of dried herbs. The herbs rattled on the packed earth. A guard looked down and then to the midwife. The ox driver's cart groaned to a halt. The king's eyes flicked toward the disturbance, and then locked onto the survivor when she stepped onto the dais margin. "Stop her," shouted a voice. A guard leapt forward. The survivor held the paper up with two hands. The high ritualist's eyes narrowed and he pointed at the ledger tied to his hip. "Survivor witness." The king, voice low and exact. "Bring that forward. Show the people what you hold." The survivor should have dropped the paper. Instead, she placed it on a flat stone between them and opened it so the ink showed. The crowd leaned in. The high ritualist stepped forward with a ritual bell held like accusation. "This is theft, the high ritualist. This is sacrilege. Those who steal from rites invite chaos." He did not look at the king. He looked at the crowd as if asking for judgment. The Cannibal King ran a fingertip along the crown's carved bone and spoke in a voice that did not allow argument. "Let the law decide. The law is the right. The right binds the people." His eyes were slow and precise as he named the survivor in a single syllable that closed down space. Hands seized the survivor. Someone struck her side. Pain flared. The crowd moved like a tide pushed by the king's command. The midwife shouted, "Read it! Read it now!" And someone around them began to chant an old phrase to buy seconds. The high ritualist hesitated, one hand on his staff. The hesitation was small, a tiny stutter in the ceremony, but it opened a gap in the king's armor. The survivor thrust the torn page forward. A young man from the crowd, one who had been at the binding feast, took the paper with shaking fingers and read names aloud. "Cato marked." Leia marked. Luga marked. "These are not offerings," he said. The red names landed like stones in water. Whispers rose, then anger, then a scattered cry. The High Ritualist's jaw worked. The Cannibal King clenched his hands around the edge of the dais.
"Traitor!"
"Someone shouted thief!" called another. The king's order returned. Seize the betrayer, brand the dissent. The survivor found herself wrestled down while the midwife tried to shield her body with a basket. The ox driver shoved his shoulder into a guard to slow the seizure. The recruit who had betrayed them stood frozen with guilt etched in his face. The High Ritualist moved closer and spoke low to the king. The crowd's sound swelled like wind through reeds. There the chapter reached its climax. The survivor exposed the ledger, the crowd saw the list, and the king's punishment was immediate. Chains clinked. Someone struck a branded implement to sear the survivor's cheek. The High Ritualist's voice rose in ritual condemnation and then broke into a practical command. "Mark her as treason. Mark her hands. Take the ledger back." The survivor tasted metal. A hot line burned on her jaw and smeared salt across her skin. She did not scream. Her breath came short and sharp. The midwife grabbed a rag and pressed it to the wound. "Survivor witness," the midwife said once. "Hold still." A guard tore the paper away and pressed it into the High Ritualist's grasp. He flipped pages with a bureaucrat's speed, fingers stained with ink. The king's men reclaimed the ledger as if retrieving a household account. The High Ritualist paused over the torn page and then shut the book with a deliberate slap. Outside the ring of torches, watchers who had once bowed began to whisper. Some looked at the king and then at the High Ritualist. A few faces that had shown devotion now registered a new calculation. The survivor's bloody cheek and the red names had rewritten the public script. If only a little. That small crack became the seed of doubt. They smuggled the survivor away after dark. The midwife slit a torn strip of cloth and bound the wound while the ox driver led a small group through back alleys. The recruit watched them go, his hands empty and shaking. The High Ritualist reclaimed the ledger and tucked it beneath his robe as if burying proof. Back in the reed shelter at dawn, the survivor pressed her fingers along the cut on her cheek. Pain throbbed, but she felt something else. A persistent ember that refused to extinguish. She reached into her tunic. The torn page was gone. The ledger had been reclaimed. She had no more written proof. The survivor's mood shifted again. Fear had morphed into a raw, stubborn clarity. Without the page, memory had to become ledger. She began to recite names aloud, and the midwife wrote them into a soft, scratchy cloth with soot and a sharpened reed. The survivor recited dates, places, the sound of knives, the way the king pronounced names at the dais. The midwife's hand moved quickly, letters pressed into cloth with care. Their voices were low and precise. Each spoken name became a record. Cateau, the survivor, third harvest. Leia, binding feast. Luga, market morning. I see her name. The midwife replied, I will copy this at once into the ledger of births and deaths. I will hide it in the midwife's records, where no priest will look. They worked until the reed shelter smelled of smoke and ink. Each name they preserved was a deliberate act. Memory turned into material proof. The survivor taught the midwife how the marks in the ledger corresponded to rites and to forced disappearances. The midwife repeated the details aloud to anchor them to speech. They did not promise safety. The midwife and a handful of villagers learned to move like a small cell. Watchful rotes, coded knocks, a signal with the midwife's shawl. The survivor practiced small rehearsals of the ritual exposure in quiet rooms, imagining the king's stare and the high ritualist's hesitation. A surprise arrived 3 days later. A grain merchant the survivor had helped once returned with a scrap of conversation. A guard admitted in a tavern that one name in the ledger had been misread and that the high ritualist had scrawled a correction. The survivor and the midwife traced the correction back to the ledger entry and found the mark that assigned a household to a sacrifice had been added after the initial writing. The twist altered their understanding. The ledger was not merely a schedule. It was a tool rewritten to suit the king's need. They realized the High Ritualist had the authority to alter fate on a page. The revelation changed tactics. No longer could they hope a single public exposure would dismantle the system. The ledger said it meant the ritualist could override the people's memory with ink. The survivor felt anger harden in her voice. "We cannot depend on a stolen page again," she said. "We must preserve names elsewhere, in places the ritualist will not check." The midwife nodded. "Your list becomes our ledger. We hide copies in the midwife's records, in the grain accounts, behind the baptism list. We teach safe ways to remember names. They made copies by memory, by the midwife's needle, and by secret marks on loom threads. The survivor traced letters on the inside of a bowl, so the marks were only visible when wet. Each concealment was an act of quiet rebellion. In the weeks that followed, rumors spread. People whispered about the torn page and the bound woman who had been branded. Some avoided the ritual grounds. Some moved closer to listen to the king's announcements. The High Ritualist conducted rites with renewed ostentation. The king increased public ceremonies as if to smother questions in spectacle. The survivor watched from a distance. She moved through markets and mended a neighbor's pottery to avoid recognition. She kept the midwife a small ledger wrapped against her chest. The High Ritualist, for his part, increased his staff checks and rubbed his thumb along the ledger's spine whenever he passed the granary. The king's stare found his way into private rooms again. A recruit who had betrayed them came at night to the reed shelter and left a carved bead on the midwife's threshold. He did not speak. The bead was a confession cast in wood. The survivor took the bead and pressed it into the palm of the midwife. "He helped us then," the recruit said finally, voice thin. "When I thought my daughter would be taken, I gave them what they wanted. I had no choice. But I could not forget what I read. Then help us now in a way that costs you nothing they can take," the midwife said. "Tell us who among the king's watchers will answer to a quiet knock at midnight." The recruit named 3 men. They were not new. The names were the sort that a ledger loved. Steady, ordinary. The survivor repeated them until they fit the shape of her mouth. They were building a net of memory and human witnesses, not a single exposed page. The chapter closed on a concrete moment. At dawn, the survivor sat beside a hidden pool of reeds and began copying names into a new ledger stitched from a length of faded cloth. The midwife needed a paste of soot and glue and handed the survivor a reed sharpened to a fine point. The survivor dipped the reed and wrote the first line. Her hand shook, then steadied. She wrote the names she could recall and the places where the king's chosen had been taken. Outside the reed shelter, a dog barked once and then fell silent. She tied the cloth ledger into a roll and handed it to the midwife. "Hide it where you bury the census rolls," she said. The midwife nodded and took the roll into her skirts. The survivor looked at her own cheek, where the branded line had scarred. She pressed her blood, wet finger to the wound to feel the dry heat. Then she turned and walked away from the reed pool with the midwife at her heels. The final beat was small and concrete. The survivor began copying names from memory into a hidden ledger, creating a record the High Ritualist could not simply seize. The act made a promise by action rather than speech. The chapter closed not with a vow shouted into the night, but with ink pressed into cloth, and the midwife tucking the roll beneath the census bundle. A hidden cargo of names that would carry the story onward, the unmaking of a king. The survivor witness pressed the torn page into the messenger's palm, while the Cannibal King lifted his hand to demand silence from the square. Suspicion tightened her fingers around the scrap. She had watched inked names long enough to know the pattern they formed. She kept her voice low and her steps small because exposure would mean the ledger's secret returned to the day's accusation. The central problem was clear within seconds. If that page reached the elder with no questions, the ledger would stay sealed, and the sacrifices would continue. If it was found, the messenger and any known courier would be dragged before the high ritualist and branded as traitors. That is why she moved. That is why she risked another exchange in public. She had once stood by the altar on the night the bound man bled out, and the Cannibal King declared the binding feast finished. She had felt the knife cut and heard the crowd fold its breath away. Those facts lived in her hands as the thin line of a scar on her wrist. Now, in the market tribunal, the ledger page bent under the messenger as thumb like a small, dangerous leaf. The survivor witness kept her chin down, counted the merchant's stalls, and told herself to trade speed for certainty. She had suspicion in her chest. Suspicion pushed her forward. In the first minutes she chose movement over reflection. Because movement could save names, keep it flat, she breathed to the messenger. "I will," the messenger replied, eyes flicking to the raised dais. The Cannibal King sat inches above the crowd on his raised seat, bone crown catching torchlight. He wore his regalia the way a blade wore a sheath, close, precise, necessary. His gaze rested without searching. He commanded stillness and people obeyed. Around him the town's tribute had become a tribunal. Offerings stacked in rows bound men on low benches, and a ring of guards who kept the alleyways clear. The survivor witness had come with one aim: deliver the stolen page to someone who would act, and she had assumed anonymity would be her shield. That assumption broke when a guard's foot scuffed her ankle. The messenger's shoulders stiffened. The guard hauled the messenger forward before the high ritualist could finish his chant. A thin line of dread replaced suspicion in the survivor witness's mouth. Her first emotion shift arrived as action. Suspicion gave way to fear when the guard's hand closed on the messenger's wrist. She pushed through the crowd. Her shawl snagged on a cart's iron hook and tore, leaving a ragged edge that left a red thread on the stone. An external event happened then. The guard produced the messenger's palm, unfolded it, and the torn page fell to the cobbles like a pale accusation. "What is this?" the guard captain demanded. The high ritualist stepped forward, his charred staff thumping on flagstone. He read the cramped ink with a finger and did not look at the king at first. "These names are not offerings," he said. "They are lists." "They are," someone in the crowd hissed, and a woman cried out, because she recognized a name. The ledger had always been spoken of as scripture. Now the paper named allies and feeders, and those sent to the altar under other pretenses. The crowd shifted, as if the square had become a beast, and everyone had found a stone lodged in its ribs. The survivor witness kept moving, pushing between stalls while the messenger tried to speak over the guard's hand on his throat. "They'll take you inside," said a voice. Not the king's, not the high ritualist's, but the rebel messenger's, low and urgent. The survivor witness answered with emotion instead of words. She pulled the messenger with her toward the alley that led away from the ritual grounds. This decision changed her balance. The second emotion shift arrived rapidly. Fear settled into a cold resolve as she and the messenger dodged a vendor's cart and vanished into a network of narrow lanes. Twice in the alleys, they drew breath. The messenger flattened the page against his thigh. He kept glancing back and murmuring a plan. They aimed for an elder known to covertly oppose the king. A woman who kept the ledger of the town's births and deaths for practical reasons, and who had once refused to hand over a child to the house of ritual. The survivor witness had seen that elder's face in the ledger's margins. Seeing that face again meant a chance at public reckoning. They did not reach the elder. A patrol had cut through a side street and 3 guards boxed them in. A scuffle followed. The messenger shoved a broom aside. The survivor witness struck at a shin. A hand closed on the messenger's shoulder and the page tore from his grasp. The torn paper fluttered and landed where an old man selling ropes stooped to pick it up. For a moment the alley held only panting and the scrape of leather. Someone shouted. The torn page left the messenger's coat and moved into a stranger's hands. A child in the market ring held up the scrap 2 minutes later. Someone in the crowd had unfolded it and showed names. Voices rose, short, sharp fragments of speech that carried across the square. The ledger's entries were read aloud by people who did not know the ritual's secret language, but who understood the sound of betrayal when it hit them. "That is my cousin's name," a woman shouted. "That man helped the king last harvest," another said. The high ritualist stepped forward and found himself the object of new attention. He had overseen the rites for decades. He had kept records that the king claimed were sacred. Now the crowd pointed at his ledger entries and tied them to bodies under the altar. He did not answer with prayer. The high ritualist fumbled for the charred staff and lifted it like a badge. "High ritualist," the guard captain called, voice hard and immediate. "Explain these lists." The high ritualist's mouth worked. "These records are of obligations and of sacred debt. Names are not what you think. Your names have victims now," someone called from the back. The crowd's voice pushed the ceremony into disorder. The Cannibal King moved like a predator whose teeth had struck an unexpected bone. He tightened his jaw and ordered guards to seize the person who had shown the page. He tried to reclaim the ritual by force. He raised ceremonial orders. He named traitors. The square answered with a surge instead of silence. This was the escalation the survivor witness had hoped for and feared in equal measure. Behind the dais, the high ritualist confronted the king with deliberate steps. The third beat, a private test of loyalty, unfolded in a narrow alcove of woven banners and low shelves of ritual vessels. The high ritualist pushed the charred staff into the king's chest, almost a touch. "You ordered the ledger filled this way," he said. The king looked at the list as if seeing ink for the first time. "You accuse me?" he asked, voice flat. "I accuse the exposure of names that are meant to be sacrifices, not allies," the high ritualist replied. They traded short, sharp lines in quick succession. The king answered with a demand for loyalty, while the high ritualist cited procedure. Guard captain stood by, his hands on his belt. "Enough," he said. "We either hold the ritual or we end the business here." The conversation moved like a blade. Each line a measured cut. 3 to 6 rapid exchanges occurred. They were tense and controlled. The king snapped a small order and sent guards to retrieve the page from the public ring. Outside, the survivor witness and the messenger ran. They rounded a stacked stall of woven mats, and a patrol of guards spilled into the alley. The messenger stumbled and dropped the scrap. The survivor witness lunged and recovered it. She tucked the paper inside her shawl and felt the damp of her own sweat under cloth. Her breath came in counted pulls. She had one plan: carry the page to an elder house and force the ledger into a public hearing. The second external event happened when a guard's spear caught the messenger's shoulder, and the messenger swore aloud. "They have my father in the outer pens." The messenger said, voice thin. "Then we must move faster," the survivor witness answered. They darted into a thinner passage where carts barely fit. The survivor witness took a risk and left the main alleys, crossing through a courtyard where a woman stooped over a pot. She handed the page to the rebel messenger with a precise motion and pushed him toward the elder's cluster. A patrol cornered them before they reached the elder's house. The messenger made a lunge for the gate, and a guard tackled him to the dirt. The survivor witness went to pull him free. At that moment, the ledger page was heavy in someone's hand in the crowd. A man with a loud voice climbed atop a barrel and read the ink aloud. The names were precise. Not only victims, but men who sold supplies to the king, allies who had grown rich, and then been named as offerings to secure loyalty. The crowd's understanding became a weapon. Understanding sharpened into outrage. An old woman who had lost a son to the altar spit and demanded the high ritualist's head. The crowd surged toward the dais. A chaotic flow of bodies toppled low benches and overturned offerings. The Cannibal King tried to command order with a short, barked phrase. The high ritualist received a stone that struck his temple and blood ran in a thin line down his cheek. The climax began when the king stepped forward to strike a man who had called him murderer. The crowd closed in with objects and voices, pushing the ceremonial order into physical collapse. On the dais, the Cannibal King lashed out. A fight broke between guards and townspeople. The high ritualist was shoved and tripped. The survivor witness found herself at the edge of the ring, watching a bound prisoner thrown from beneath the toppled altar as men pushed. She grabbed at straps and yanked a chain loose, pulling one prisoner free. Her hands worked with practiced urgency. She had seen bindings before and knew which not to pull. Blood slicked the altar's edge. The king received a wound along his arm. His ceremonial sash tore. "Stop!" The king shouted, voice hoarse. "Stop him!" The high ritualist cuffed, then spat blood and fell silent. A militant in the crowd seized the high ritualist and dragged him down the dais steps. The survivor of the binding feast, there were now multiple survivors, helped throw the high ritualist to the ground. The king, wounded and stunned, lost his ritual posture. The crowd stripped the bone crown from his head, and someone hurled it into the dust. The third emotional shift occurred here. The survivor witness felt fear fold into something harder, relief edged with a new responsibility, as she dragged a man away from a guard as boot. Guards tried to reassert control but found themselves outnumbered and disorganized. Families took back those the king had listed as offerings. The ledger, once the high ritualist's tool, had become evidence and bait. A group of elders seized it and held it between them. The town's leaders, who had accepted the ritual under fear, now argued openly about trials and public reckonings. "We must read every page," said one elder. "We must burn it." Another countered. The survivor witness sat on a turned crate while someone tore a strip from her shawl to press to a wound on a freed prisoner's arm. Her hands trembled but did not stop working. She refused to look at the king beyond the fact of his limp body. She had wanted names freed into the open. That aim had been achieved, yet the ledger's presence had already set new problems in motion. Vengeance, random reprisals, and the risk that power vacuums would replace the old tyranny with something worse. At a makeshift council under guttering torchlight, men and women argued over custody of the ledger, over how to hold trials, and over the legality of the king's past orders. The survivor witness listened while a scribe sealed the ledger into a chest with crude locks. She watched the high ritualist wheeled away by two young men who might have killed him if not for the hope of testimony. The council named a small committee to list victims and to arrange public hearings. The survivor witness was asked to speak. Her voice came in short lines. "I saw the knife on the night of the binding feast," she said. "You saw them count names," an elder prompted. "I saw inked names that were not offerings," she answered. "They were lists tied to power." Her testimony was plain and factual. It contained no pleading. The council asked for more evidence. The ledger would be read in full. The people shouted for punishments and for trials. The survivor witness felt her hands go cold and then steadily warm again. The emotional arc that had begun with suspicion had passed through fear and resolve, then through fierce action, and now rested in measured clarity. A twist came when the ledger's later pages named an elder who had been thought sympathetic to the townspeople. The revelation shifted loyalties. One of the councilists confessed to having supplied the king with meat during seasons of famine, listing logistics now tied to ritual offerings. The doubt that had driven the survivor witness into action returned in a different dress. Now she suspected that corruption had been broader than any one office. This new suspicion altered plans. Trials would have to be public and thorough, or the town risked replacing one secret with another. During the night, guards who had refused to join the uprising slipped away and gathered with the wounded king. They tried to load him onto a cart. The survivor witness watched the scene from the square's edge, fingers locked around a small carved bead from her necklace. She had kept that bead since the first binding feast, when she had hidden a scrap of cloth inside it. Now she held the bead as a quiet reminder of who she had promised to remember. She did not cry. Her breath shortened when the king's old guard tried to drag him from the square. She stepped forward and called out to the elders. "Do not let them take him without a hearing," she said. "We will hold him for trial," the eldest said. They brought the king before the council on a board across two crates. He could not stand straight. His sash was stained and his hand clutched at a wound. The high ritualist sat on a low stool, face bruised. The council opened the chest and the scribe began to read aloud from ledger pages that had once been hidden. Names echoed in the square like evidence being counted. The trials that began then moved through a night of accusations and a morning of testimony. The council called witnesses who named dates, who described sacrificial procedures, and who introduced records of payments. The survivor witness recounted the 3 nights she had watched the king preside, and how he assigned names. Her voice was measured and factual. She supplied dates and small concrete details, the sound of a bell, the smell of smoked meat, the scar on a guard's knuckle. Those details anchored the hearing in observable facts rather than in rumor. Outside the hall, people who had lost family members listened and compared names. Some cried out for immediate blood, others for the ledger to be preserved as proof. The council decided on provisional custody. The ledger would be sealed in the town archive, and a public list of those named as victims would be compiled. The survivor witness watched the scribe tie the ledger with new cords and press wax into a seal. She felt the final emotional shift then, from tension into a constrained exhaustion with a slice of satisfaction. She had helped force open a secret, but the cost of knowledge was not light. The morning found the square changed. Children moved among tents that sheltered freed prisoners. Families hugged people they had thought lost. The Cannibal King sat behind a rough wooden bar, and the high ritualist had been placed under guard. The town's elders prepared lists of charges and scheduled trials. The survivor witness handed a small carved bead to an elder and said, "Keep this with the ledger." Remember who they were. They agreed to at least 3 public sessions where ledger pages would be read and victims would be identified. The survivor witness stayed through the first session and saw names tied to deeds. She watched the high ritualist answer for procedures and saw the king forced to listen as people recited the cost of order. The final twist of the chapter came when a guard who had long served the king confessed to having been ordered to lie about a burial in exchange for his family's safety. His confession expanded the circle of responsibility and made clear that the ritual's cruelty had depended on coercion as well as on ritual doctrine. By dusk, the ledger was resealed and locked in the town archive under the watch of newly appointed keepers. The council made a formal statement. There would be trials and possible restitution. People argued into the night about how to conduct justice without spilling into revenge. The survivor witness found a quiet corner and wrapped her torn shawl around a freed prisoner's arm. Her hands trembled and then steadied. She did not articulate a moral lesson. She acted by binding a wound and by writing down a list of names on a scrap of her own cloth. In the pre-dawn hours she stood with an elder who sealed the chest. The elder handed her a small ledger copy, folded and simple. "Keep this safe," the elder said. She nodded. She folded the bead into her palm and felt the engraved notch of its wood. The final paragraph must end with a concrete action. The survivor witness watched the scribe press wax to the chest, and then she walked away, carrying the bead and the knowledge that the ledger had been sealed but not erased. A scribe locked the ledger beneath a shuttered chest as the survivor witness pressed a single bead into her palm and walked away.